Good Shabbos. This week we read two parshios, two portions, Achrei Mos and Kedoshim. And although there are many topics presented in these portions, I'd like to focus on just three words. V'ahavta l're'acha kamocha. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. And very famously, Rabbi Kiva says, Zeh klal gadol b'Torah. This is a fundamental rule, a great fundamental rule in the Torah. He seems to be elevating the idea of behavior between man and his fellow man, which is the mitzvahs of bein adam lechavero, between man and his neighbor, to a point which is almost saying it's more important than all of the rituals and all of our behavior in terms of our spirituality and a relationship to God, that really the morals that we have and that we act out on a day-to-day basis between our neighbors and our friends and our family is more important. And when we look at it, some of the commentaries have problem with understanding how could we be commanded to love your neighbor. The Ramban Nachmanides points out, in a sense, you're saying you should have a certain emotion. And emotions we just assume are instinctive or come to us over time, but we have very little control over it. We don't think of controlling who we love. We love who we love for so many different reasons that predate the interaction between us and that particular person. So Nachmanides says, well, actually, you're not commanded to love your friend. You're only commanded to act out as if you love your friend. In other words, do acts of kindness to your friend. And as the Torah says in this parsha, also we give tzedakah, we give charity, we treat the poor well. Right before this says, Lo sisnas achicha b'levavecha, you shouldn't hate your brother in your heart, but rather hacheach tachiach samisachi, you should reprove him. In other words, you should say what you feel. In other words, it's telling us how to act. Maybe the Ramban probably understands that eventually you'll come to have the emotion of love, but the Torah can't command the act of love. Another approach to this is Maimonides. And Maimonides talks about Ava, love, in a very different way. He starts off with understanding the idea of love in the sense of loving God. And he says, also very famously, at the end of his Hilchas Tshuva, the laws of repentance, he says, Eina oev HaKadosh Baruch Hu ela b'dash yadehu. You only can love God with the knowledge that you know Him. And some understand Maimonides as saying, well, that's when it comes to love of God, but that's not what it means when it comes to love of your fellow man, or even describing or defining the love that a man or a woman might have for their spouse. But I don't believe so. I believe what Maimonides is doing is he's redefining love and saying the way you love someone is by knowing them. The way you love God is by knowing them. And he actually starts off in the very beginning of his Code of Jewish Laws, in the second chapter of Yesodei HaTorah, of the principles of the Torah, and he says there's a mitzvah of loving God, and he says the way you love God, I've referred to this other times, the way you love God is studying His creation, knowing His acts, knowing what God does. And the more you know about God, the more you understand about God's creation, about what He has done, that's what love is all about. Because love is really a deep understanding and knowledge of that other person, of that other being. In this case, it's referring to God. But the same could be true in regard to your fellow man. And if you think about it, even in terms of marriage, spousal relationships, and love between a man and a woman, it's not just superficial. It's not just attraction on a physical level, but love is something which is much deeper. And that love is the commonalities, the common experiences. When we share secrets with someone, the more we know about that which is deep down within a person, within their personality, the more we hopefully appreciate them. If you don't love or know or understand that person, then you won't love them. You'll come to hate them. But if you yourself represent the ideals of what a human being should be, and therefore you're going to appreciate somebody else who has very similar ideals, similar perspective on life, then you're going to love them. You're going to feel a closeness to them. You're going to be drawn to them. And then it might manifest itself emotionally. It might manifest itself even physically. But all of these ideas are a manifestation of just knowing that person, understanding that person. So with God, the love might be emotional. You might be moved emotionally and spiritually, where you're dancing and singing before God. But ultimately, it all comes down to knowing, understanding God, and knowing your spouse, for example. That creates love. And therefore, v'ahavta l'reacha kamocha might be, the mitzvah might be to truly understand everybody else, to be tolerant of where they're coming from, to understand their perspective. And of course, if there's someone who represents sort of the bad traits that human beings sometimes present, then actually it might be a mitzvah to hate. Maimonides says it in another place, that someone who doesn't have the correct beliefs and correct understandings, maybe you could say the correct morals, it might be a mitzvah to hate that person, because we don't want to love and draw near to people that are evil. So therefore, what Maimonides might be saying is, ultimately, to truly be that moral person who is loving of somebody else and acts, as Nachmanides says, as acts towards someone in a loving way, the best way is to make sure that you understand that person, and therefore it comes naturally. And I would like to add that it says you should love your neighbor as you love yourself, kamocha. And perhaps the only way you could understand someone else is first understanding what you are. You first have to love yourself before you can love other people. And by that, I mean to love yourself is to understand yourself, to know what you stand for, what's important to you, what your drives are, what your goals are, what your philosophy is, what your attitude in life is. How do you think about everything that there is in the world? When you understand yourself, when you really dig deep down into yourself and get what's the core of your personality, then you know what you'll appreciate in someone else. And sometimes the commonalities are extensive, and that might be someone you want to spend the rest of your life with, you might want to be friends with and neighbors with and enjoy a lot of time with. Or it might just be that you have certain commonalities, that every human being, as long as he or she is not an evil person, you still have enough in common that you could see sort of the divine within them. You could see them and their tselem Elokim, the fact that they're created in the image of God. They also have certain aspects of them which you could appreciate. So although there might be certain things which you don't appreciate, maybe the mitzvah is to focus on those things which you do appreciate. As long as they're not evil, they might be different. They might be a different religion, a different culture, different ethnicity. They might have different ideas and different perspective in life. At the end of the day, you have enough in common that you could see that you understand that person. And therefore, you're drawn to them to a degree. Either a more or less of a degree, you're drawn to them, and therefore you could do those acts of kindness. If you understand yourself, if you know what's important to you, and you see that which you have in common, and you see that you're both divine beings, meaning you're in the image of God, and you both have certain morals, and you stand for certain principles, even if those principles are different, but you could appreciate them and understand them, then that is really the true ahava, that is the true love. And therefore, according to this understanding, it's not difficult to love your neighbor. It's just you have to put the time into making sure you understand them, you tolerate them. But again, tolerate here, I don't mean just like, well, I'll let you do what you want. It's to understand that they might have a different perspective and a legitimate perspective. And you could even see yourself thinking like that, perhaps, if you came from where they come from. And therefore, that's the mitzvah of v'ahavta l'reacha kamocha. So again, even though there's a famous statement by Hillel which says, what does it mean to love your neighbor? Don't do that which you would hate to be done to yourself, you shouldn't do to others. I would suggest that might be just the minimum. But there's much more than that. As this parsha, as this portion says, there's so much more than just not to steal. If you look through the portion, you'll see in the beginning, in Achrei Mos, that it's not just to not to steal from your neighbor. It's to treat them well, to do acts of kindness. Lufnei iver lo sitay michshel. You shouldn't put a stumbling block in front of a blind person. You must treat them much more than just not stealing. You have to think of them as you would yourself. The minimum is not to do something harmful to them, but more than that, we should go lefnim mishurasdir. We should go beyond the letter of the law and do really what we would want for ourselves, because we understand them when we see them as somewhat of an equal. Good Shabbos.